I'm Richard Dunn. I'm the former general counsel of DARPA, here with David at MacDill Air Force Base in Florida.
My name is Captain David Rothzeid. I'm an acquisition officer in the United States Air Force, currently stationed at Defense Innovation Unit Experimental in Moffett Field, California, otherwise known as Silicon Valley.
And we are jointly teaching a class on other transactions to Special Operations Command contracting personnel.
So Rick, this is our third time together talking about other transactions with a diverse community of government civilians, military, contracting officers, acquisition officers. What would you say is this spurned on increase in participation or knowledge thirst?
A number of things have happened. We can't ignore the fact that just over a year ago, Congress made the authority for one of the other transaction statutes permanent and codified it at 10 United States Code 2371B, a firm congressional endorsement on the use of this other transaction authority that actually goes back over 20 years. And that same amendment to the statute actually greatly broadened its scope and provided for a very simplified method of follow-on production. So that is one big spur. Ashton Carter, the previous Secretary of Defense, apparently recognized that there was a power in the commercial community, especially the community that exists in some of these high-tech areas, Silicon Valley, the I-28 corridor in Boston and in Austin and the Pacific Northwest, that isn't being tapped by the Department of Defense, and their technologies are not being integrated into defense systems, and DoD is not taking advantage of some of the best and brightest folks in America. He commissioned the Defense Innovation Unit Experimental. So I think those are the primary things that have spurred this increased interest.
Yeah, no, it's so true, and it's definitely been a pleasure getting out in front of these audiences. But before we go too much further, some call you the godfather of OT statute, and I know you know it backwards as well as you do forwards. Could you maybe give a primer on what exactly is an other transaction, and how far does it date back?
Well, we call them transactions, we call them agreements, but I mean they are, in the typical sense, contracts that have all of the elements of a binding contract, and can be virtually like commercial contracts as opposed to contracts that are awarded under the highly regulated government purchasing system, which is under regulations called the Federal Acquisition Regulation. Those regulations do not apply to other transactions, and that's why they can replicate commercial contracts. The idea for other transactions stems back to the National Aeronautics and Space Act in 1958. I was actually at NASA headquarters in the General Counsel's office during the 1980s and became very familiar with that. When I was appointed the first General Counsel of DARPA, I took the idea of other transactions with me to DARPA, and I had the opportunity to interact with Congress and have the Department of Defense Authority enacted, and we entered into our first DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, entered into our first other transaction in 1990. Other transactions were a growth industry during the 1990s. The 1990s was the era of acquisition reform. People were beginning to understand that there was a problem with the end of the Cold War. The defense industry had a couple of options that should have been available to them. One was that all of the companies could stay in existence. They could continue to be suppliers to the Department of Defense, but they could also diversify and become commercial companies and exploit commercial marketplaces. And that didn't happen. And instead, the defense industry consolidated, and there were fewer and fewer companies, and those companies that remained as part of the defense industrial base tried to become the best defense contractors they could be, rather than highly diversified companies. And the driving force for that was the fact that they were encumbered with all the rules and regulations and overhead that the Federal Acquisition Regulation imposes on them. So the idea that there was an alternative system out there was appealing to many people. The authority was originally limited to DARPA, but the original Science and Technology Authority was extended to the entire department. and other folks began to use it. And then in 1994, we got authority to extend it beyond science and technology into prototype projects related to weapons and weapon systems. And then 2 years after that, that was extended to the rest of the department. And there was broad use of the authority and some major systems, ship systems, the Global Hawk, long-range autonomous unmanned reconnaissance vehicle was developed as another transaction. There were many science and technology projects. So it was widely used. It was on an upswing for about 10 years. There were two statutes, as I said, a science and technology statute and a prototype statute. The one was basically dual use in nature, and the other was basically aimed at defense contractors trying to introduce flexibility and new business practices into the defense industry. The year 2000, with the National Defense Authorization Act of 2001, that clear dichotomy became confused. And the prototype authority had a cost-sharing element added to it, which made it unattractive for defense contractors. And that didn't result in an immediate decline. There was still a growth industry, if you will, in other transactions for the next few years. And then there was some bad publicity related to the Army's Future Combat System, a very large acquisition program. It was unfortunate and inaccurate information was spread about it, and that, along with the cost-sharing requirement and some poor leadership on the part of senior people in the Department of Defense, actually negative leadership of acquisition officials towards other transactions, was the beginning of a decline that went on for the most part of 10 years, from which we've only recently seen a partial recovery.
I know I'm the beneficiary of its most recent upswing at Defense Innovation Union Experimental and how we've been able to engage the commercial sector. I think it would be prudent for those who are going to watch this to know what the first other transaction was during the space agreement.
NASA had a very early use of another transaction that became the model for what are called launch service agreements. And that very early agreement resulted in Telstar 1, was the first active communications satellite. It was entirely funded, developed, owned, and operated by American Telephone and Telegraph Company. It was launched into orbit by NASA on a NASA launch vehicle, which was actually a derivative of a military-developed launch vehicle. And the company, AT&T, paid NASA for the launch. So America gained a substantial technological and space capability with private investment at its core.
So let's back up. Not only did AT&T develop the satellite Telstar 1, they then paid the government to launch it on one of their rockets.
Through another transaction, a Space Act agreement called a Launch Services Agreement. Yes, the funds flowed from AT&T to the government.
Wow. It certainly seems a bit different than the way we have been doing business, at least since I commissioned. I won't speak to earlier, but I'm sure you could.
Well, launch services agreements became common in DARPA, but the way they do them and the way DoD does its launches are not identical.
But there is a foray now kind of in the way we've been engaging with companies like SpaceX, right? And using other transactions with them to harness some of the technological leaps that they've made in the space industry. So it's almost like what was old is now new again.
Absolutely. There is a new commercial space industry is emerging, not just SpaceX, but many potential business opportunities in space. In particular, the Falcon 9 launch vehicle, they're trying to develop a fully reusable launch vehicle that actually initially has the first stage return to Earth and land vertically after launching its satellite. That project was a joint project between the company and the government. It was called the Commercial Orbital Transportation System, and it was styled as a public-private partnership between the government and SpaceX. That was executed under NASA's Space Act authority, that is to say, as an other transaction.
Where do you see this going? And what does it take to put together an other transaction? DARPA is famous for having extremely competent program managers and forward-leaning contracting officers who've been in the game for a while. In your estimation, in order to put together an other transaction that is relevant and provides a lot of utility, what does it take? What is the recipe of success?
Understand that other transactions are fundamentally different than the procurement contracts that are entered into under the highly regulated FAR system. And unfortunately, throughout the Department of Defense, since its heyday, there's been a backsliding with respect to that. The leadership in the department charged with the policy lead, the policy advocacy of other transaction is in fact the same office that leads and is the policy advocate for FAR, and they favor FAR contracts, and other transactions have been left adrift and without a strong advocate within the department. In fact, the creation of the Defense Innovation Unit Experimental, but by the Secretary of Defense, the lead of the department, was a real departure from the lack of leadership that had been shown. I mentioned the organization, but it's the organization and its use of other transactions that is symbolic of the embrace at a very high level. Unfortunately, at somewhat lower levels within the Department of Defense, OSD in particular, and the military departments, there is a lack of leadership that is not reflected in the same sort of thing that Secretary Carter did. So that's the big drawback. A FAR, a Federal Acquisition Regulation mentality, executed through people who are schooled in that system. Contracting officers take on the title of agreements officers, but their training and experience and thought processes are still wedded in this highly regulated purchasing system, and they haven't been freed up to embrace a freedom of contract mode, a commercial contracting technique and regime that's really necessary for OTs to reach their full potential.
All right, so it sounds like you're kind of saying we need to rely on good business judgment, business acumen that potentially the commercial sector has mastered in whatever industry that they're currently operating in. So what are maybe
That's absolutely essential, David.
Yeah. So what are a couple basic tenets that are departures from the FAR in the OT world that kind of come to mind?
The terms and conditions of the contract under the Federal Acquisition Regulation are 95% dictated ahead of time. And the focus on the part that isn't dictated is on cost.
Right.
And this is what time and energy is spent on, the details of cost. In the other transaction world, a much broader array of issues is brought to the table where folks can negotiate, where they can speak openly, where they find room to collaborate, find areas of mutual interest when they craft their contract relationship between themselves. It's not that the price involved, it's not that the mutual contributions of the parties, both with respect to price or cost and other issues, are unimportant, but they're part of the entire regime of relationship that can be created with an OT. That just doesn't exist under FAR because, as I said, 95% of the content of the contract is dictated ahead of time, and it's just a matter of how much somebody's going to pay for something that one of the parties has basically unilaterally decided what the specifications and details are without interacting with the expertise and knowledge of the person who's going to develop or build the thing.
So you're saying that all the terms and conditions in another transaction can be negotiated, right? That it's not going to be specific FAR clauses that dictate intellectual property and data rights even before we've developed a statement of work or come up with mutually beneficial goals for the arrangement.
We're looking to collaborate and find those mutually beneficial goals, and therefore everything has to be open to negotiation to allow us to do that.
In the beginning, you were talking a little bit about 2371, 2371B. To those listening, they may not be so familiar with 10 U.S. Code and the statutes that therefore follow. Could you delineate quickly between 2371, 2371B, their parent and subordinate relationship to one another, if it does exist, and then also maybe highlight quickly on 2373.
2371 was the original Other Transactions Authority, transactions that are not standard contract grants or cooperative agreements, these commercial type transactions as they can be negotiated. It was an attempt to reach out to the commercial community, the startups, the VC-supported firms, the best and brightest who don't normally do business through the FAR system. Each party contributing financial resources was baselined in that, but it was not essential. Outcomes were still within the regimes of research and development. 2371B was a follow-on to 2371. It's actually, the statute actually says that these transactions are under the authority of 2371. So the two statutes are intimately related, but the original 2371B was specifically targeted not necessarily to the commercial, the startup, the VC. It was targeted toward defense contractors and defense-specific technologies. Resource sharing, cost sharing was not a part of that statute. It authorized prototype projects. Today, under 2371B, as it was amended and made permanent a year or so ago, also can graduate into follow-on production, and in a very simplified fashion. So that's the basic distinction between the two statutes. One is to push science and technology, the other is to create prototype projects that might be production items for the Department of Defense to enhance military capabilities.
And then 2373.
2373 actually does not fall under the terminology of other transactions. It's related to the two other statutes in the sense that the Federal Acquisition Regulation, the Armed Services Procurement Act, does not apply. If the items that are authorized for purchase under 2373, which include a wide variety of technologies and products relevant to the Department of Defense, are purchased in quantities sufficient for experimental use and assessment of operational utility. As long as the quantities are limited, the Federal Acquisition Regulation doesn't apply to those 10 U.S.C. 2373 purchases.
Well, Rick, this has been awesome. I know your time is valuable and that you'd probably rather be off writing military history, which is your true passion. But the passion that you've imbued in talking about other transactions to the audiences, I think, is really starting to shift the paradigm as we continue to explore what we can do given our limited resources and the fact that the commercial sector is where a lot of the innovative research and development is happening. So with that, we'll continue to carry on, and thank you so much.
Great working with you, David.
Pleasure.
All right.